Australian Greens are extremely concerned about the fast-tracking of intercountry adoption processes. We've seen the trauma that can be caused by flawed adoption practices to the child, the relinquishing family and the adoptive family. For some, there is an assumption that adoption automatically leads to a better outcome for the child. And we obviously understand the very deep— Excuse me, Mr President, I'm sorry.
Yeah, thank you, Senator Searle. Could I just ask senators just to keep any noise down and maybe have meetings outside of the chamber? Senator Searle.
As I was saying, there is an assumption that adoption automatically leads to a better outcome for the child that is being adopted, and obviously on many occasions that is true. But there's many that it's not true for. And we obviously understand the deep desire for people to become parents. For those of us that do have children, it really is impossible for us to imagine what it must be like to want to have children and being unable to. However, having said that, we do in this country know the consequences of some of the adoptive processes, both for all involved, the relinquishing parents. And I use the term very carefully when I talk about relinquishing, because we know from past experiences that parents, in some cases, were not relinquishing parents. Those children were taken, and those babies were taken from those parents. We know, however, from past experiences that adoption processes can have bad outcomes for the child, obviously for the relinquishing parents, but also we know from experience, but also for the adoptive parents. And there is no guarantee that the circumstances that we saw in this country, not but several decades ago, there's no guarantee that those practices, in fact, aren't being carried out through this process, through overseas adoptions. We cannot pretend that we are not aware of the lifelong consequences of adoption on the child who becomes an adult, on the relinquishing parents and the adoptive family. We now have high-profile people promoting adoption, and while I'm sure they are coming from a desire to help children, we cannot allow this to override the need for proper consideration, protections and oversights. And we need to ensure we are listening to evidence that is based on policy and appropriate expert stakeholders, not just on the goodwill of those high-profile people that are pursuing this cause. Sometimes I'm deeply concerned at the expense of the child's interests. And I'll come to the overwhelming need to make sure that we are doing this in the child's interests. Australia must be vigilant to ensure the necessary safeguards are in place to protect parents from being coerced into relinquishing their child, and I say relinquishing in inverted commas, their child, to ensure that intercountry adoption is a last resort and there is appropriate post-adoption care, support and services for children and families. The Australian Greens are deeply concerned that the so-called one-stop shop where children may be seen as commodities and the goal is a swift acquisition of them is not the way to go in adoption. This country has been there. We know the consequences of that swift approach to adoption. The presumption that adoption is good and that Australian parents are all loving and that children will have a better life here, that is not a fair assumption to make. What evidence is this based on? I would argue that there's overwhelming evidence to show that if we aren't extremely careful in adoption, it can lead to very poor life outcomes for, in fact, everybody involved. That all legal rights to extended families, heritage, homeland are extinguished. We're deeply concerned that this may occur, and that children, in fact, have no say in this matter. We need to be asking the government on what evidence base is the decision to facilitate easier and faster overseas adoptions. This evidence, what evidence is relied on to show that this in fact will be the best interests of the child and that they can guarantee when you start allowing adoptions from non-Hague countries that all the concerns that have been raised, and I'll go into those in a minute, can actually be addressed. I'm deeply concerned that the government may be so quickly forgetting the history of child removals And the reports that we have seen in this country, Bringing the Home report, the forced adoption reports, and the 3 reports on forgotten Australians and former child migrants. These are lessons that we can never, ever forget in this country. This country has watched the intergenerational harm caused by displacement of children and those and dispossession. We've got the stolen generations, we've got forgotten Australians, and we've got the legacy of that travesty of forced adoptions. Those directly affected continue to pay a very heavy price, and I have spoken at length on those costs in this place. Unless we get this right, Australians will unfortunately continue to pay a heavy social price, a heavy price in the terms of it costs to health, because we know it has poor health and life outcomes. Justice will also, we believe, be threatened for these people. Which takes me to this bill and why we are debating this in this place now. The Greens are concerned about a number of the aspects of the Australian Citizenship Amendment Intercountry Adoption Bill of 2014. The allowing of intercountry adoptions through bilateral agreements outside of the safeguards, transparency and procedures of the Hague Convention are a concern for us. That the bill does not focus on the best interest of the child, and we know where this leads. That the bill could facilitate an environment for forced or coerced adoption practices to take place. Again, this country knows very well what occurs there. That there is a lack of requirement for adequate post-adoption support services. These concerns were clearly shared and articulated by many submissions and witnesses during the inquiry process into this bill. There are many risks associated with adopting through bilateral agreements with non-Hague Convention countries. The Hague Convention of 1993 has set out guidelines which considered the child's interests to be of paramount importance. Bilateral agreements don't necessarily meet the same standards. The stated reason for this bill is to cut waiting periods and allow for easier and more convenient adoptions. International Social Service Australia said the benefits to adopted parents are grossly outweighed by the risks associated with adopting children in non-Hague countries. We know countries that have a very limited child protection process do not have the capacity to monitor individual cases. In these countries, individuals or criminal organisations can exploit the loopholes in intercountry adoption. As International Social Service Australia said, whilst Australia has signed the Convention, it is difficult for Australia to monitor the systems in countries that are adopting children that have not signed the Convention. For this reason, I think promoting bilateral agreements with non-Hague countries and finalising adoptions in overseas countries have lots of risks associated, so I do not support this bill. We are deeply concerned, the Australian Greens are deeply concerned that this puts the convenience of parents above those of the best interest of the child, but also of the birth parents. The Australian Greens argue that the risks outweigh the convenience of speeding up adoption with countries that have not signed the Hague Convention. The interests of the child are better protected by the safeguards and standards of the Hague Convention, and we would prefer that Australia encourage non-Hague countries become signatories to the Hague Convention rather than simply caving in and doing bilateral agreements with these countries. Then I come to the best interest of the child. The Australian Greens believe that all legislation that affects children must be in the best interest of the child. Evidence from Dr Gillespie and UNICEF emphasise the need to keep the interests of the child at the centre of the inter-country adoption processes. UNICEF said, "We emphasise the best interest of the child. We note that the CRC, the Convention of the Rights of the Child, talks about primary interests of the child, whereas the Hague Convention talks about consideration of the child being paramount in inter-country adoption. UNICEF would not support any dilution of these standards. In order to properly protect children and families, the first thing we need to do is work with countries to enhance and improve their child protection systems and supports for children, parents and children through that, parents of those children through that process. The best interest of the child must stay at the centre of our decision-making process. In the first instance, the Convention on the Rights of the Child says the child should be with its own family. And this is what we should be focusing on, making sure that every instance is explored where the child could stay with its own family. I know, and I'm not Pollyanna, I know that in many circumstances that is not possible, but that really does need to be at the centre of our thinking. In all circumstances, that is what we should be striving for. As UNICEF says, if that is not possible, and that is also about why we do development, to try and bolster systems to ensure that children and families can be supported, then that child should stay in its own culture and with family members or extended families in that country. Again, our job is to help build systems with those foreign governments to make sure that those child protection systems are strengthened before we get into this. If all that is exhausted in a way the Convention says that intercountry adoption should be a last resort after those have been exhausted, then we look at how best we can minimise and protect. Therefore, we think we need to be ensuring that at the centre of this legislation should be the best interest of the child, and unfortunately we don't think this legislation goes far enough to ensure that. Now I want to look at forced and coerced adoption, something this country knows a lot about. I remind this chamber that in a little over a month we will be acknowledging in this place the 2nd anniversary of the apology to those affected by forced adoption in our own country. The past forced adoption processes in Australia have caused ongoing trauma, and I don't think anybody in this place is unaware of that trauma to all those involved. As Professor Naeem Musham said, who's the chair of the Forced Adoption Implementation Working Group, noted, the consultation for the submission for this bill has had a re-traumatising effect on affected people. In other words, this is an ongoing trauma for all involved. We have a responsibility to ensure that we do not create situations for such practices to reoccur. The Australian Greens are very concerned that this bill could assist in making coerced or forced adoption practices more likely. As UNICEF said, it is important to remember that intercountry adoptions can take an extended time because of the complex nature of the process. It takes time and due diligence to ensure that children are genuinely able to be adopted. We do not want to see any more cases where parents adopt into the Australian context only to discover that the child should never have been considered genuinely available for adoption. That is a really complex thing for parents to have to live with. What does that mean for your parenting? What does it mean? What has it meant for your family? What does it mean for the child, and what does it mean for the biological family? Unfortunately, illegal and unethical adoptions are more likely in non-Hague countries. Without due process and systems around child protection, children and families are at risk of exploitation. International Social Services Australia said, the more bilateral agreements we have with non-Hague countries, the more unethical and unlawful adoptions we are going to have. As UNICEF said, it has been noted in other countries' contexts that sometimes there is not due process around free, prior and informed consent from parents, and situations where parents are actually being pressured to surrender their children to adoption programs. Our deep concern is that this, by agreeing to non-Hague Convention adoptions, that these practices will in fact occur more. And then I'd like to talk briefly about post-adoption support, an issue that came up significantly during the inquiry as well. We're concerned that faster adoption processes provided by the bill may mean that important supports and services don't occur. One issue that is not included in the bill is post-adoption support, or adequate post-adoption support. As several of the witnesses stated, appropriate post-adoption support is very important. There is no provision in the bill to ensure that bilateral agreements will be required to have the same standards in post-adoption support and follow-up as the Hague Convention. The Hague Convention currently requires post-adoption assessments that usually occur in the first 12 months post-adoption process. There is also follow-up with the relinquishing family from the country of origin. was pointed out to the inquiry that it's essential that there is contact and support for the relinquishing family, the child and the adoptive family. There are several issues with post-adoption support, including the need for long-term post-adoption support for both families and adoptees, and also the support and assessment that is important to go back to the country of origin in that first year. International Social Services said the post-adoption support is very, very crucial. It is not just the formal reports we're talking about, it is the informal support that the family needs and may require throughout the child's upbringing. Also, we are funded by the New South Wales Government Support Services for adult adoptees to search for their birth parents overseas. It is important to understand how much of a profound impact that can have on adoptees in later life when they become an adult to find out that their adoption was unethical and unlawful. I know from the work that I have done with forgotten Australians and former child migrants and forced adoptions and the stolen generation how important that it is that services are available, in fact lifelong services. We are currently finalising through the forced adoption process, putting in place support services after all these years for those that are affected by forced adoptions. That is critical and important evidence that shows the lifelong impacts that flawed adoption processes can have on people. Just adopting a child, unfortunately, does not have necessarily a happy ever after conclusion. We're already having significant problems with this process in Australia after all those decades of the forced adoption processes. We are in danger by loosening up so loosely the overseas adoption processes. We are in danger of repeating that, of putting another generation of people through that. And as I said, I deeply understand people's heartfelt desire to look after children that they think they can help from bringing from overseas. And I'm not saying for 1 minute that these processes are always flawed. But we know from the evidence that many have poor outcomes. And we know the impact that can be lifelong on so-called relinquishing parents or biological parents. Some people call them birth parents.